you've been studying cultural conflicts for a long time. You've written books that kind of cover 100 or more years of history looking at these conflicts. So where do you date the kind of war against the past? When does that really, for you, begin to kick in?
And one of the things that people have learned over the last century, or at least they think they've learned, is that children are much easier to indoctrinate than the older generations. Children are more suggestible. Imagine that you have kids kind of who have got no experience of what has gone on beforehand, who are not familiar with the rituals and the practices and the ways of their community, who basically are almost like blank sheets as far as the teachers are concerned. So they come to schools, and they can be indoctrinated much faster than any of the other generations, and that's why you have a situation where almost overnight you have a whole generation of young people in many parts of the West who declare that they are not proud of their nation. In fact, they are ashamed of being British or Australian or American. They are not particularly interested in the symbols and the rituals of their society. They despise their own flags. They would rather fly an LGBTQ flag than the flag of their own nation. And therefore, children become extremely vulnerable to this targeting. And the reason why I wrote the book is because, as far as I'm concerned, we lost about 3-4 generations of young people who've been indoctrinated in this hysterical sort of dehumanization of what has gone on in the past and what has happened in history. And therefore, we are at risk of creating one generation after another who have completely detached themselves from where they come from. And that will have a very disruptive, and is already having a very disruptive effect on public life.
Yeah, and I guess, buried in that is the question of, well, why is the past really so important? Today we live in a time where we're told that everything is so new and unprecedented, from globalization to digitization. We're kind of told that those elements of our history, they can't really shine any light on the present, and that it's actually quite difficult to use the past as a guide. We're told it's kind of basically irrelevant what happened in the past. So you've kind of studied this sociologically, philosophically. Why is the past so important, and what is it about having a kind of sense of our past that helps us build the future?
It was in the 1970s that many of the old ideologies unraveled and where they ceased to have any influence upon public life. It's in the 1970s that you have a generation of elites who run our institutions, our cultural institutions, our education systems, and even other sectors of public and private life, who have become educated into a way of thinking that was antithetical to those of their ancestors. So in the 1970s, you have a generation of people who running our societies, who feel completely alienated from their own past, and who not only feel alienated from their own past, but who actually believed that the way they gain legitimacy, the way they gain a degree of moral authority, is by being in the forefront of questioning in the past. And even many conservative politicians fell into this trap. And I always remember an incident where David Cameron, who was the then Prime Minister, the Conservative Prime Minister of Britain, made a little speech where he referred to a racist incident. And he basically said, we're not going to go back to the bad old days of racism. And that really struck me, because in previous times, you talked about the good old days. Now, all of a sudden, the good old days were being displaced by the bad old days, by a conservative prime minister. And that showed that by the time we got to David Cameron from the 1970s onwards, these elites began to regard their own past in a very negative way. And not only regarded it that way, but they believed that it was their responsibility to criticize it and to basically call into question the taken for granted rituals and traditions of previous generations.
Yeah, and I guess that orientation distinguishes you a little bit from many conservatives, right, who just treat the past as something that's kind of happened and there to be revered, whereas you take the position that actually, if we're going to change anything in the future, that it's really important to have a relationship to our past. What does that kind of, I guess, genuine or dynamic relationship to the past actually look like?
Well, the bottom line is that our humanity depends on our relationship with previous generations. Unlike other species, human beings evolve and they learn from the experience of their parents and their grandparents and their ancestors. Human beings are never just simply the products of a particular biological event. They are the products of a journey that humanity has undertaken a long, long, long time ago. And each generation appropriates the experience of the past. It kind of revitalizes it. And as we evolve, our humanity depends on this constant process of keeping and conserving our tradition, revitalizing it, and then moving forward on the basis of that. And that organic connection that we have to previous generation, the transmission of knowledge that takes place from one generation to another, is essential for giving us the guidance that we need to make our way. We learn from the experience of the past. It doesn't mean to say that we simply repeat the past, but those experiences are constantly giving us the resources to know what to do in difficult circumstances. But not only that, particularly for the young, that connection gives young people the basis for their identity. So the young people who are born understand that they're not just basically abstract human beings just coming out of nowhere, but they come from a particular community, from a particular family, they have a particular religion, they have a particular identity, which makes them who they are. And that's what gives them their sense of meaning and their place in the world. Now, if you take that away from them, and that's more or less what we're beginning to do now, then you undermine their capacity to develop and cultivate their identity. And we're seeing the destructive consequences of that, because once you have a crisis of identity on such a large scale, then you have everything from so-called mental health problems to a very disoriented, powerless group of young people who are, in a sense, afraid to look at the future and to try to basically take the kind of risks that are necessary to make that future their own.
And I guess, I mean, does that distinguish you in some ways from lots of other maybe fellow travelers in the world of conservatism, where the past is looked at as something that is almost to be revered, it can't really be changed, and that rather you have this kind of orientation that we have to have a connection to the past because it's precisely we have to engage in the future and we have to revitalize those traditions. It's not just, I mean, there's that term of John Stuart Mill's of dead dogma. It's no longer just, it's not just dead dogma, it has to kind of come alive through our engagement with it.
Yeah, it's a kind of dynamic relationship. So looking at the writings of Hannah Arendt, the political philosopher, she really believed that the essence of education was conserving the past. But for her, the mission of conserving the past didn't mean that you just kept it the way it was, but that through the conserving of that past, that conservation element, you create and unleash a dynamic that allows you to revitalize it, to develop it. And to me, the most exciting example of how this occurs is the Renaissance, because the Renaissance was a period of rebirth, where what people were doing, particularly in Italy during this era, was taking the incredible insights of the ancient Greeks and Romans, being inspired by that, but at the same time, almost like redefining it and translating that into the experiences of their time and going forward. And to me, what we should be aiming for in our war against those people who want to destroy the past is our renaissance, our rebirth, where we take the insights and the legacy of European civilization, making it our own, acquainting the younger generations with it, and then going forward on the basis of that.